Hi everyone, as I was introduced, I am Ronni Shendar. And I will be speaking in English, and since I did live for parts of my life in the United States, I sometimes tend to speak very, very fast. And if you want to ask or didn't understand something that I said, please just let me know or just remind me to slow down so that my words don't get jumbled with one another, because I've been told that I tend to do that. And I will also make a few stops during this presentation to offer you all to ask some questions, since sometimes things that seem very clear to me are not necessarily clear, and I have no idea how much background any of you have about Israel or the Middle East or Jerusalem, or if you maybe been there, etc. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm a visual artist. I work mostly in photography, video, and live video performance. Working mostly in audiovisual performance on the visual end of things. And in general, I work a lot on the seam line between music and visuals, meaning that I always work with live musicians or I do a lot of music videos, but this is the place where I'm at, so I feel very at home here. I am originally from Israel, where I grew up and lived most of my life, and in the past 4 years, I ended up living in Cologne here in Germany, and I apologize that my German is okay, but not good enough for this presentation. So please excuse me that I will continue this in English. And how I ended up here, I will get to as well. I'm going to speak a little bit about being an artist in Israel, cultural production in Israel, what it means to be an artist or to produce artistic events in Israel, since the reality there is very, very different than the reality that exists here. And in order to do that, since I'm not necessarily, I don't come from the academic world, and I didn't necessarily research this, but I have a lot of experience of work, and I will tell a little bit about the different productions and things that I've been involved with in cultural production in Israel, both as an artist, as a curator, and as a producer. And through that, will open a little bit, will allow us to look a little bit about what are the obstacles and what is the situation that exists there, and how it affects all of us from there, or independent artists that live and work in Israel. Where to start? Art, music, and culture are always very, very contextual, meaning that they rely on culture, they rely on a place, they rely on the culture of the place, on the language, and of course that art and culture in Israel is contextualized into the Israeli reality. And that reality is a really, really complicated one that I won't even try to fully explain, because then I would have to stay here for a few years and you would all get your PhDs in Israeli history. So I will touch a little bit on the things that I think that are important to understand where me, or the work that we've been doing in Israel, which is me in the sense of my age group and the type of work of electronic music or new media art, where it stemmed from and what are the conditions in which we worked at. Some of those conditions which led us to be in Germany. So Israel, maybe I will show you a map. I think that everybody knows what Israel looks like, but I was told, to keep the audience activated. Let's bring some visuals in. Sorry that I'm doing it like this, but I don't have any better way of doing it at the moment. All right, so right, Israel. Israel, of course, was established in very, very specific circumstances, in very specific historical circumstances, and it's relatively a very young state that is still defining itself. Through its entire history, its very short history, it has been built on communities of migration, meaning that ever since its establishment over 60 years ago, there has been continuous migration to Israel of Jews from around the world mainly, and the society in itself has completely, or continues to reinvent itself, because the population is completely different, meaning that in the 90s, for example, 1 million people immigrated from the ex-Soviet Union, which is 1/5 of the entire population of Israel. So what happens to an entire society when such a huge influx of migration continuously happens, as it happened in the 20s, in the 40s, in the 90s, and throughout, is that it's continuously changing, and its culture within itself and its cultural background is also continuously changing. Israel is also actually a relatively poor country, although it has, well, relatively to the Western world and or we'll call it the Western or EU and North America and such. 35% of children live under live in impoverished conditions, meaning that they live in poverty. The gap between rich and poor is about twice as high as it is on the average of Europe, and the economic situation is changing very, very rapidly in a very strong influx of capitalism, that these distances are becoming much larger, that poor are becoming more poor and rich are becoming more rich, and obviously that has an effect on everybody in society. Salaries are much lower than here. Living expenses is about as expensive as here, but people make about half as much of the money, so people have to fight pretty hard for very, very basic living. And one big part of it is that there's quite often, there's a continuous conflict that's happening, whether we're looking at the occupation and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and wars that have continuously been part of Israel's history, also during my lifetime. And that, of course, has a huge, huge impact on art and culture in general. Needless to say that art and culture are not at the priority of a society that's in war or a society that feels that it's in war. There's not much space for art to be happening unless it's what we call mobilized art, meaning art that is used by the nation or used by the government to promote certain ideas. But art that is not part of that can either be art that is against something, art that is protesting, and everything else basically doesn't have a place to exist. So in a place where wars have been continuously happening every certain amount of years, it means that the construction and the rise of art and culture has had to change with that, and the effects are quite extreme. I was born in Haifa, which is somewhere up there on the sea, but I returned and lived most of my time in Jerusalem since about the year from 1997. Jerusalem is, of course, the heart and center of whatever the three monotheistic religions, but it's also the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Part of the city in itself actually is in the occupied territories, is part of Palestinian lands, and the entire discussion regarding the future of a peace process or any future between Israelis and Palestinians relies on the decisions that will be taken regarding Jerusalem. So it's a very, very intense place, to say the least, and one that is continuously under everybody's watch. Jerusalem is a very, very funny city. It's a city that, I think you can see it there, it says in red, Jerusalem, and what you see on the right-hand side is the Palestinian occupied territories, and the left hand is Israel. Territories speaking the territories that were annexed by Israel in 1967. So Jerusalem has always been kind of a border city. It's a little bit of a dead end in some sense. Between 1948 and 67, the right part was actually part of Jordan, and this was an actual border. So it was always kind of on the very, very edge of Israeli society, and that has affected the culture that's there. And even today, although Jerusalem by now it's larger than what you see here. Maybe I can show you. It's a little bit, this is what I said, the situation is very confusing. So to really understand Jerusalem, you'd have to understand this map, which is going to be a little bit difficult. Not impossible, but would take a few hours. But Jerusalem has expanded. My point being is that it's a border city, and it's a city that has always been sort of on the edge of things. It's a very, very religious city, obviously, and the population that lives there is also very religious, both on Jewish, Christian, and Muslims, as well as other religions that are definitely a minority. The population is very, very mixed, I would say. There's very, very different communities that live there, from very religious ones to very secular ones, from Jews to Muslim, etc. And everybody is basically fighting for survival. It is the poorest city in Israel, meaning that the population that lives there is the poorest, and that is mostly because there is such a large community of ultra-Orthodox, which most of them do not work, but rather receive pensions to study Torah, and the Palestinian population, which is poor because of certain laws or restrictions that are based on them as living in East Jerusalem, which they are not citizens of Israel, but only residents of Jerusalem because they're from actually the West Bank. If that makes any sense, I can clarify that, but it's small details. It's also the home to, and is Israel's capital, or Israel is trying to make it its capital, meaning that all the government bodies are placed there, along with elite institutions. Now, where does art fit into all of this is a very, very good question. So because Jerusalem is such an extreme place, maybe I even have some pictures, it has actually been home always to the most radical of politics and the most radical of art. It has always been home to the most avant-garde art in Israel because it has been such an extreme place where politics are so prevalent and are so part of daily life. So it already started in the 60s with very, very radical political groups that started and broke off from the Communist Party and were the first groups to speak outside of Israel about this new internationalism and speaking about anti-capitalism, etc., to the rise of the Black Panthers, which there were the Israeli Black Panthers, which are Jews that came from North African and Middle Eastern countries in the 50s and were deprived and did not receive the same rights as Jews who were living in Israel from beforehand. And they were living in very poor neighborhoods and had a big uprising that was based on the American Black Panthers. So they were, of course, also in Jerusalem. And with all of this political and radical movement that came, that had a lot of very, very critical thinking and very radical thoughts, also started an art movement. And this art movement always brought together these questions of art and politics. In the 80s, there was legendary music that came from Jerusalem, and these were the first musicians that outspokenly did not go to the military, that would speak, that would sing political lyrics. I mean, these were things that at that time in society were absolutely not accepted, specifically not during, this was the time of the first Lebanon War and the first Intifada, and they were the first ones to really be outspoken about it, not only in their lyrics, but also in their actions of really not going to the military. They asked a lot of questions regarding the difference between Jewish identity and Israeli identity, and what are the difference of being an Israeli, or what does it mean to be a young person, because at that time they were the first generation that was actually born in Israel from new migrants. There's been Jews that have been living in Israel for generations and generations beforehand, but from this new movement that came, whether it be in the 20s or after the 40s, they were discussing what does it mean to be either first, second, or second generation born in Israel, and what does it mean as an identity for being Jewish. It's very, very different than growing up elsewhere. After that started, of course, electronic music that started to grow in the United States and made its way all over Europe and also all the way to Israel, and Jerusalem became sort of a hub for independent music and independent electronic music. The reason I'm telling you all of this is only to explain where I come into the picture and what it looked like then. And we're almost there, I promise. The end of the 90s was a very, very hopeful time in Israel. It was time of the Oslo Accords, which was the peace process. The Nobel Prize was won at that time, and everybody thought that this would be the end of the conflict and that a new era would begin and that previous wars would finally be over. Unfortunately, this was not the situation, and but people didn't know that yet. So in the end of the 90s was this feeling of euphoria, of a new period. There weren't any wars, and electronic music was a part of that in the sense that clubs and mega clubs and clubbing and nightlife became a huge thing in Israel, and with that, so did house music. And that is the beginning of how Tel Aviv got its name as being such a clubbing city. I don't know if you've heard that, but as it seems, Tel Aviv is quite famous for its party and its nightlife. So that was during this period that there was a lot of connection between Tel Aviv and London and New York and so on. On the other hand, during this time, Jerusalem started to have underground parties and underground raves, and people who were creating what was later termed as autonomous zones, or trying to break concepts of culture and music or partying by going into abandoned, everything from government offices to abandoned military bases to whatever, and trying to recreate parties and art that would take place in this time. At the end of the 90s, it was clear that the peace process is about to end, and in the year 2000, the second Intifada broke out. For most Israelis, this was a really, really big shock, and they, as for them, and the majority of people in Israel, did not spend time in the occupied territories and didn't realize that while the situation in Israel was becoming so much better during the 90s, the situation in the territories, on the other hand, was absolutely not, and the situation was deteriorating. And so most Israelis were very, very shocked when the Second Intifada broke out, and it seemed to them that this means that the Palestinians don't want peace, and the Palestinians don't want to continue the peace process. And it was a very, very dreadful time, but it was also a very, very violent time. This is about the point that I come into the picture. The Second Intifada was, I have no idea how old you are, but in early 2000, Jerusalem was bed for a lot of suicide bombings. And for a few years, it was really like a war zone, and there were dozens and dozens of bombings that took place in the city and in Israel in general. And this whole interest that existed in Israel beforehand of musicians that would come, or if we're looking at the clubbing world, of DJs that would come, completely diminished. People in Israel were, of course, completely depressed by the situation because it was absolutely horrible. And so this whole celebration that existed, this euphoria of the end of the 90s, completely crashed. For me at that time, I was working in human rights, and the situation in the Palestinian territories was really, really terrible. It was a time in which the Israeli military was actually in the cities. There was not enough medicine and food coming in. So for people who were active in human rights, this was a time where everything was just an emergency, because we thought that this is a dire situation. It was more or less the closest to a war the conflict was as far as we knew it in my generation, and we thought that we're going to act in order to end a situation that will end quickly. Unfortunately, the situation did not end as quickly as we were hoping, and we found ourselves a few years later still doing the same type of work. At this time, there is some normality that returns to life, because that's just how humans are. And even in dreadful conditions, humans still fall in love, they have kids, they go eat dinner, and they have romantic walks on the beach if they're allowed to access it. So life on both ends continued, definitely not equally. But at that time, I also became very, very involved in the cultural scene in Jerusalem, and specifically in the night scene of organizing alternative, let's call them techno parties. And the reason that I've always been so drawn, or the reason this connection to me is very, very clear, is because in general, I think that nightlife and clubbing culture has always attracted people who don't fit the day life. They don't fit the 9-to-5 life. It's usually dropouts, it's people from the edge of society that are attracted to the nightlife because they don't feel comfortable in whatever it is that society has to offer. That's why the gay scene has been such a big part of nightlife and clubbing. And so clubbing has always had this political background to it that always discussed freedom and liberation. If we look at early techno or early house music that had so much to do with what was happening in Chicago and liberation in Chicago of the gay scene, these things have always been tied together. Or if we look in Germany at electronic music here, that a lot of it came in order to define a new type of music, music that wasn't related to the fascist background, music that wasn't related to the history of Germany, but to create something completely new. And so I think these things for me were always intertwined, and of course for us that were living there, we also needed to create our own culture in order to survive. At that point in time, I actually came several times here to Germany. We were several times on a speaking engagement to speak about the situation in Israel and in the Palestinian territories and to fundraise for certain projects we were doing. And I came on an exchange program between Israelis and Germans, or Israelis, Palestinians, and Germans that were both artists and working in human rights. And then I met this person whose name is Till Roman, and he was a DJ. And he spoke to another friend of mine who he knew from Tel Aviv about coming to Tel Aviv and performing. And since I was organizing parties at the time in Jerusalem, the person said to him, why don't you go speak with Ronni? She can organize something for you in Jerusalem. And Till, who's also known as Glitterbug, who's a producer from Germany and a DJ from Cologne actually, came to Israel and played at one of our parties, or rather at a friend's party. And he played this Cologne minimal techno. And Israel had techno that was hard and fast and industrial, and it was dark, and the parties were always in abandoned places. And all of a sudden comes this music that we've never, ever heard before. It was so much slower, it was so much like pretty and fluffy, and everybody just kind of stood there and said, are we supposed to dance to this? We didn't really get it, but it was intriguing. And it started off a real relationship between him and some of the local DJs that were just so curious about what is this music. And so, following a few other friends from here, from Germany came, and a few internationals that were living in Germany came to Israel also to perform. And at one point we brought some artists from Israel to Germany to perform here. And there was a lot of interest that took place on both sides. Artists that came here have never been here before and definitely have never performed here. In Israel at the time there was a lot of independent electronic music, but it was completely, what's the word I'm looking for? Isolated. There was no distribution. There was two record shops, I think, in Tel Aviv, but there was no equipment to make electronic music. People came to Europe, they bought something at the flea market in Amsterdam and imported it to Israel. It was something that was happening completely on its own. And so for people to meet people who, in Germany, where there is distribution and record shops and everybody has a label, and at the time it was still, techno was still a really big thing here, it was a really amazing experience. They had so much to learn and discuss and to talk about. And for a lot of people that came here, to come to Israel was almost, I would say, a life-changing experience, because it is, I think, specifically coming from Germany to Israel with the historical context and the social context is a very overwhelming experience. And I can say that even for me, living here now and spending so much of my time here and only coming to visit Israel shortly, twice a year, that even for me it has become like, oh, it's just a very different being here and being Jewish. There's not that many Jews. There's a very small community in Cologne. But coming to Israel and realizing, wow, almost everybody around me is Jewish it has a big impact and makes one think a lot about what this place would have looked like if history would have been a little bit different. So we were doing these exchanges, and there were a lot of questions and a lot of interest, and there was a lot of questions that weren't clear about what does it mean to come and perform in Israel for an international artist? Does that mean that they're making a political statement? Does that mean that they're supporting Israel? I mean, there's still a conflict, the occupation still exists, and this was definitely not peaceful times whatsoever. There was a lot of discussion. This is when the discussion of boycott began, and these were not questions that even I necessarily had an answer to, because we were still talking about parties that were about celebrating life, celebrating music. They were not a political demonstration. But we found that these discussions in themselves are really, really important. And we found that the interest on both sides was amazing. And so we said, okay, let's try to push this one level further. And that's when we established a festival for electronic music and for new media art that's called C.Sides. And C.Sides is, let me get this out of your way, excuse me. I have to find am I going this way? No, I go this way. C.Sides is, this was in 2004 that the idea came together. We wanted to create something that worked on several levels. Something that would, on one hand, promote and expose Israeli artists that are working in electronic form, because they were not, this was not an existent form as far as Israel's society was aware of. It was not considered music. People didn't even know that something like this exists. People didn't know what electronic music was. And there was a lot of stuff that was happening and a lot of small independent artists. So we wanted to create something that would draw attention to this thing that was happening. And we also wanted to create a platform that not only celebrates this music, but also discusses a lot of the questions that we were talking about. What is the place where art and culture meet? What does it mean that we're artists working in Jerusalem in the situation that we're working in during the occupation, during whatever political situation is happening? How can we make that part of this festival? And bringing international artists, it was really important for us that people don't just come, perform and leave, but that people actually come, that they meet local artists, that a real connection is somehow made, and that we're able to also speak about these issues and let people understand a little bit more of the situation. So we created this funny thing, which is called C.Sides, and we brought all international artists for a week to Israel to come and participate in educational tours, to come and see what these words are. What is the occupation? What does that mean? What is East Jerusalem? What is West Jerusalem? What does it mean that there is poverty? What is the social situation in Israel like? What does it mean to be an artist? And we had each of them actually at that time sleep in people's houses, so they actually got to know people. And we had 3 nights of performances, lectures, video screenings, and a lot of different stuff that happened. Why the name? That's what I wanted. Thank you for reminding me. C-sides, I just want to get so you understand how it's spelled, and then I can explain it. I really apologize that I'm doing this. Was not my intention to do it like this. So C-sides is spelled c.sides, and we wanted to deal with music we wanted to deal with independent music. What does that mean? Music that is not part of the mainstream, artists that are not doing commercial work, but artists that are doing music for the sake of music and trying to expand and question the borders of music. So as records have a side A and a side B, we wanted to talk about what music would exist on side C. And that's how we came with the idea of C-sides, that we're somewhere beyond, somewhere else exploring that territory. And we thought that it sounds like the sea, which we thought would be nice. Jerusalem doesn't have a sea, and that is definitely kind of sad. The one thing that was missing for us was a sea. Okay. I want to show you a little bit what that looked like. So this was, we tried to put this together. Of course, you need money to put this together. Culture in Israel is not necessarily funded very well. There is not much money that goes to culture because there's always some security need that is much more important. So most of the cultural funding sadly happens on through the private sectors, through foundations, philanthropists, and there is only so much that they can support. So it's actually very, very hard to find support. The municipality of Jerusalem is quite archaic. When we went to meet with the head of the cultural department, he didn't have a computer in his room, so trying to explain to him electronic music didn't work all that well. And he was speaking to us very proudly about the hora dancing groups that they established in different neighborhoods, and that this was like the prime project of the Jerusalem municipality. So it was very, very hard to work or to try to get this thing going somehow. And I'll show you a short little film that we made after this first attempt of a festival in 2005. That should work.
הוא לא קוטנה. אתה יודע, כמו בצופים.
זה ידוע.
לא, התוכנית שלי הייתה אחרת.
טוב?
אין יותר, זהו, זה נשבר.
C.Sides came about 2 years ago when cooperation and exchange began between local artists and specifically artists from Germany or international artists residing in Germany. So when we started to create this platform, the things that came up were not only specifically exchange in the artistic manner of music and media, it was also exchange as far as basic tools that we're talking about today, such as sustainability, how are labels running themselves, and also, of course, issues that have to do with historical and political content, both about the relationship between Germany and Israel, Germany, Israel, and Palestine, Israel and Palestine.
Incumbent upon a Jewish person in their, like understanding of Torah and, how that relates to issues of human rights and things of that nature, that what's going on here is wrong, and then you think you have a very, you have a, not just a need, but an obligation to speak up about it and to be proactive on it, you more or less jeopardize your position and your stature in the community.
Talking about the German education, it's true. Like the Holocaust, the Shoah is being related to saying that here we are teaching the history of the Holocaust, and because we do that, it will never happen again.
Going through the educational system in Germany, learning supposedly a lot about what exactly happened during the Holocaust, but never ever identifying the German people with that. It was always the Nazis, for example, that did that, but it was never anything that was dealt with on a personal basis, or never anything that was dealt with on a family basis.
And he always says, this is a political act that I make music out of that because it's another way.
Is it a good political art or social work of art? People are dealing with real people in real life situations, which are usually extreme or tragic situations.
I think I want to criticize capitalism, but not this by blaming McDonald's. This is stupid and naive. I don't think that this is a critical act in a good sense, in a good or left-wing sense of political art.
I think this will be the point that I will turn to you and ask if anybody has any questions before I continue. I'll take that as, you're sure? Okay. I know that to most of you, being here and having all this amazing equipment, this is not necessarily, the production capacities that you have here is far beyond, I think, that probably even exists in most television studios in Israel. And there's of course, endless festivals here for techno, and the Eurovision just happened with this amazing screen and all this pyrotechnics. But contextually, taking this and putting this in Jerusalem and in Israel was a completely radical thing. Not because there weren't outdoor raves and not because there haven't been festivals. There's definitely a lot of commercial things that are happening, but as a non-commercial festival for this type of music, and to include panels that talk about politics and the social situation, this was completely unthinkable. And that made it both wonderful, but also very difficult, because nobody knew what to do with this. Funders didn't know. People who came from the art world said, what's all this politics? We don't want to get our hands dirty with politics. Don't make any statements. If you want art and music that's nice, make it pretty. The political foundations would say, but factually, where are you making political work? How is this embettering people? There are people who are going hungry. There are people who can't get enough medical assistance. There are Palestinians that are living under occupation. What is this helping anybody other than, supporting these nice, friendly artists? And for us, these questions were also not exactly clear. I don't have any clear answers. But what was very clear for us from the beginning is that we wanted to create an artistic event that has political content and not a political event that has artistic content. And I think that the notion that we carry through all of this is this really naive but very, very honest belief that art, in its very core, in its very essence, is a political act. Not saying that all art is, but in its essence, in its definition, it is, and it can create social change. It's sometimes a little less measurable than perhaps demonstration or creating a medical center or endless other things or going education, but I truly honestly believe that it's just as much part of changing the world. And we actually had to confront this question much more seriously with our next production in 2006, which was 1 year later, which took place in August 2006, and in July 2006, the war with Lebanon broke out. So if everything was already completely crazy, because the occupation in itself is very crazy, and the situation has been so horrible for the past years, all of a sudden there was a war, a full-out war. Now, it's very hard to explain in words what that means, also for us that were there. The situation was only in the northern part of Israel, on the Lebanese border, but Israel was attacking Lebanon with airplanes and with bombs, demolishing large parts of neighborhoods, sending in a lot of military by foot into different villages, and in return, the Hezbollah was shooting rockets into Israeli territory, and the whole part of northern Israel, all the citizens left their homes and moved to the southern parts. So this entire country was all of a sudden on alert. And there's something that was triggered, I think, for people of my age that haven't lived through, I would call it a real war, because the conflict is something ongoing that goes up and down, but it's not a full-out war, also because mostly the Palestinians have very, very simplified forms of weapons. But there was this utter fear that this might be a regional war. And regardless of myself, that I learned to speak Arabic and I spent a lot of time in the territories, I felt this fear that I think is innate within every Israeli person, this idea that Israel might not exist at one point. And I say that also because it's not only due to war, but also because of the social situation and what's happening within the society that is being rifted apart. But the essence of Israel, or being Israelis, that somewhere deep in your heart, you know that you're living in a place that in 20 years might not exist. And it was the first time for me that I really felt that. And during that time, we were producing a festival. So it was very, very, very difficult, and we asked ourselves what to do. We didn't know what to do. There was a war. We thought maybe this will change after a few days, but it was actually a very, very long period. And in that time, what happens as everywhere in culture and art starts to disappear, and the society becomes very nationalistic and very motivated, and there is this enemy, and critical discussion and critical art has no room And if you speak in this language, you also often become an enemy because people don't want to hear that. People want to feel that they're safe, they want to feel that they are winning this war and that they're going to triumph. Part of this was, living in Jerusalem, there was no war. There were no rockets on Jerusalem, and there wouldn't be because it's far too holy of a place. So the entire war, for me, was as virtual probably as it was for anybody who lived here, because I would get up and turn on Sky News and sit in front of the news and watch it, and it's not that anything was happening outside. Outside, as I said, people go to school, they pick up their groceries, daily life goes on. A huge part of the population had to leave their homes, but for me and my surrounding and my community, life had to somehow go on, which I have to admit is a very, very frustrating and bizarre feeling. Feeling that the news agencies and that the entire public discussion in Israel was so concentrated on such a singular perspective was actually part of the reason for us that we decided to go through with the festival. Because for us, we felt that if we also shut up and we don't do what we do and we don't make our art and we don't speak about the topics that we want to speak, then we somehow become a part of this war machine. Because that's what it's about. It's about shutting other things down and getting a monotonous view and a monotonous voice. And it somehow strengthened our feeling that we need to go through with this. We need to bring people to come to the festival from abroad. We need to bring Israelis to come, and we need to speak about these situations. What we did at the time, there was a group of Lebanese artists that make a festival for improvised music called Irtijal, and they were blogging about the war. And the funny thing is that they were speaking in a language that was almost so familiar to me, because they too were sitting in their apartments watching TV or looking outside. Of course, they actually had bombs falling next to them, but they were going to their bars and drinking beer with their buddies, and the electricity would go out, but what else would they do? I mean, what do you do? It's, unless you're going to go out there and demonstrate or you want to be part of it, then you're stuck in this completely unconceivable situation. And I wanted to show you, there's one of them, so there's several of them, and they're a collective, and they run this music festival, and they release quite a lot of music, and they travel here also quite often. One of them is also a cartoonist, and he had a blog where every day he would draw a picture. And it's pretty fantastic, and I thought I would quickly show it to you, because I think in his humor and his cynicism and utter despair of weeks and weeks of this war, I think he really was able to portray a lot of what it's like. So again, I apologize for my... I hope that you can read this. Let's see if I do it in full screen. Is it better? Is it legible, or do I need to read this out loud? People tell me. Can you read it? That was a yes or no question. No? Okay. So he says on the top, we are in Hamra, which is an area, and outside there are bombs. The nice sound of resolution 1701, which was the resolution of the UN for ceasefire. And there he is, Mazen Kurbaj is his name, and he always has a cigarette in his hand and some alcohol in the other hand. Day after day, the war is getting worse on the ground and much less fashionable on TV, which is also something that was very, very present, is that this war continues, but how much can the news deal with a war that was going on then for, how many weeks was it? Probably 4 or 5 weeks. You can't continuously talk about a war that by then is only partially a war. This is his translation from Arabic. Today's free game, the summer contest. Answer the following question and win 3 hand grenades. The question, are the invaders the sons of David or the sons of Goliath? Please send your answers to Mr. Ehud Olmert or to the closest McDonald's. Yesterday night was the worst night. No single bomb on Beirut. The hours of waiting for a never-coming bomb are worse than the 33 days of waiting under the coming ones. And this is their trio that they always perform together, with his Sharif Sanawi, Mazen Kurbaj, and who is on top, Raid Yassin. So they were talking about music and bombs, saying, we should do a concert, the soonest. Sure. Yeah, we have to resist. Shut up. What will happen to the Beirut scene? And again, as I said, that seeing this and the discussions that we were having were felt so similar because we were asking ourselves a lot of the same questions in not necessarily comparable positions, because my life was never endangered, nor was the city I was living in being bombed. But as far as this crazy situation, I felt a very deep connection. Come down, you cowards, I'll kill you with my pen. I think there's one more. 17th of August, after the days of anger came the days of despair. We were in touch with this collective of artists when we were preparing the festival and wrote them to ask them, on one hand, to convey our solidarity and say that there are, just so they know that there are people in Israel who are opposing, who are demonstrating against this, and that part of what we want to do as artists and musicians is to have this festival and to have an event within the festival that is an event against the war. And one of them, actually, Sharif, who's the guitar player, he wrote an article for The Wire magazine in the UK, and he sent it to me to be able to read it as part of the opening. And I think that for us, understanding that for them as artists in Lebanon, at that time being under fire, that for them it also makes somehow crazy sense that we make this festival with techno music and dancing and lights and show, that they understood that this is in some sense a path to changing Israeli society or to changing culture or to create a statement, was something that made this, of course, much easier for us, but really strengthened us that we're making the right decision here. And as Mazen wrote there, I think that the war ended actually before our festival happened. I think it ended 3 weeks before the festival. So of course, all the international artists came, even though they had big fears, but they all came because they wanted to be part of this, and they were curious, and they felt that on one hand they would be safe, but on the other hand that they could come and not necessarily make a political statement, but be able to participate in something that would educate them about the political situation and about the reality. But I definitely agree that almost when there is such an intense situation, you have to sort of keep yourself up and running and have everything going, and then once it's over, you're kind of left with all the rubble of the leftovers, and that's when the real shit happens. Excuse me. From there, I was thinking maybe I will read very quickly. Let me see if I have this. Just one paragraph from Sharif's letter that we read at the festival. I won't read the whole thing because it's actually quite long, or from his article, but he was talking about the fact that in Beirut as well, through civil war and the horrible history that they've had there, that artists always had to reinvent themselves and to reinvent art and culture. And actually before the war, Beirut became once again the center for contemporary art and music and culture that it used to be known for. And for them specifically, as people who established these labels in this festival, I mean, this really came at the time of flourishment. And he writes, "Will history stop once again? It seems like it inevitably will. The question is only for how long. Today, everyone is doing his best to keep it somehow alive by multiplying recording sessions and rehearsals, finding possibilities for fundraising concerts despite the general reluctance of venue and audience. As it did in the whole 1975 to 1995 period, the art scene will not disappear. It will survive through private or smaller scale events. Artists will undoubtedly resist, waiting for the time to come back when they will once more have a chance to build something new out of their own ashes." So, and I think that definitely happened. So I think that we were very, very focused on creating this production. It was a much bigger production than our previous one. We had 3 stages that went on both day and night with exhibition halls and installations and a screening hall, and it was a really, really huge production, and we didn't really have time to process everything that was happening because we wanted to make it happen. But what happened was, or the aftermath of this war, is that the tension was so extreme and the questions were so deep that we had to ask ourselves regarding the future of the place that we live and what we do as artists within it. If before we made the decision that art makes sense within the current situation of the occupation and that our lives make sense because it has to make sense. I was born and I grew up in Israel. I can't change that. That's my nationality, that's my home, and regardless of the political situation or the conflict or the occupation, which started far before I was born, this is the reality that I live in. I can try to change it, but that's all that I can do. And as an artist, I think these questions were also similar. I think for us it was a question of, or on a very personal level, what if I just make art that's not necessarily social art or examining social borders or political borders, but art that is maybe just beautiful. Yes, it has a content, but it's abstract. Is that okay? Do I feel the freedom to live in this place, to be in this situation, and to create something that is simply aesthetic? I don't necessarily have any real answers to that. Let me continue because I want to leave some time for questions. If there is time in the end, I can show a little bit from the festival in 2006, but it looks pretty much the same, only bigger. Stages, lights, people performing, discussions, talking, and a lot of really, really fantastic artists and music. In 2007, we realized that we're putting a lot of effort on bringing people to Israel and, being able to take people and have them re-question their ideas of what Israel is, what Israeli culture is, what Israeli music or as a place is. And we also want to make the effort of bringing artists from Israel and bringing them abroad, specifically artists that don't have the privilege to go abroad. Flights are very expensive. It's actually quite far. Today there's all these cheap airlines that go, Air Berlin, TUI, whatever. At that time there was Lufthansa and El Al. And as I said, people don't make a lot of money, and it's not necessarily possible for people to come out. So we did several events in Berlin where we did a showcase of artists from the festival, bringing together artists from Germany and artists from Israel and showcasing a little bit of what we've been doing, such as video art or screening works of Israeli artists. And then we were asked by the Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Berlin. They had a festival that they initiated, which is called Worldtronics. And the idea of the festival is that every night there is electronic music from a different place in the world. So one of the places was Japan, and the other one was Chile and Congo, and each one of these places has a real history of types of music or instruments that are used that make the music that they bring very, very special. I mean, the Congolese instruments in electronic music are very recognizable and don't exist anywhere else in the world. And then there was us from Israel. What does it mean, Israeli electronic music? What is that? Is there something like Jewish music? Maybe, but when we say that, we're usually thinking about Eastern European Jews, of like klezmer music. But Israel is something much more complex. It consists of people who came from North Africa, people who came from the Middle East, people who came from Ethiopia, Russia, Western Europe, from everywhere. And there's not one thing that, other than the fact that we're all Israeli, you can say that there's something that is defined as Israeli. It's part of the question of this entire place is what unites us other than having a Jewish identity or eventually all living in this one place. And we weren't sure exactly what to do with that within the festival. And to just bring artists to perform would have been okay, but where do we bring the content? Where do we tell the audience or be able to bring something new or something to the audience that's coming to see this? So we decided to create a selection of artists that we think are interesting, creating interesting works. And we chose for the festival to create a big installation where we did a 30-minute experimental documentary film where we went to each of these artists' homes and we filmed them and talked with them a little bit about their lives and what their lives look like, and we filmed their homes and their streets so that people that come have a little bit of an idea, what does this all look like? What does it mean to be an artist in Israel producing music? Most people don't have the privilege of going to a school like this. Most people work a full-time job, and then in the evenings in a tiny little room that doesn't have air conditioning, do what they're very passionate about, which is create music. And eventually, garages are turned into bars and performance spaces, and things happen just because people really make them happen. Today there's a few schools for electronic music, but they're private schools and they're quite small. So I want to show you just a very short excerpt I won't show the whole 32 minutes, of course, but it's just a 5-minute excerpt of this little movie we did, and then I will talk a little bit about these artists and maybe even let's hear a little bit of music, because we keep on talking about Israeli artists and music, and maybe it's time to hear some. So let me find this movie. The work is called Ma'iti, which means what is it with me? And found it. Can make it dark.
Very, very tense life here in Jerusalem. I don't know how to describe it without hurting the types of the population that live in Jerusalem, but all the combination together, it's very, very hard.
I grew up most of my life at the West Bank, at a settlement called Efrat. During teenage time, I discovered Jerusalem, which is, I look at this, that Efrat is like an ordinary suburb to a big city. Now, ignoring all the political problems with that, but as a person which was his only place and home.
The only time which I really appreciate the fact that I'm here is when I'm going to the old city, because this is the only place in Jerusalem which I really feel good and I understand why I'm here. And all the things, what is happening around, I know exactly what is going on.
I mean, all my friends from high school, from military, from the university, they left the country. So it's a bit sad for me, because I know that I'm staying in Israel. You need a very good reason to stay and live in Israel. And if you don't have this reason, and mainly the reason is family and connection to the culture. Most of the people they look for the place the easiest to live in, and it's most comfortable.
It's really hard to live here and work here and survive here. So eventually you give up, and I'm not sure where's a better place. I don't know where to go and where it should be, but I know I need to get out from here for a time.
The thing that influences me, the thing of home, of not having that home, maybe that's I think it's quite a huge part in my music when it comes to melodies, based on this feeling of home, having home, not having home, searching for this home, or feeling yourself universal because you lost one day. You just lost it. You lost the home.
So, continuing a little bit from what these people said, I think that for a lot of us that are working in art and music production, this question of a little bit what he said in the end, this question of home and identity is one that is very, very present and is very unclear or is unsolved, because most people are living a little bit in this in-between world. of living in a place that is on one hand very, very isolated, that is always in conflict, that one doesn't have much place to develop a lot of one's personal wishes or to develop one art because there's just simply often very little space for it. But also a place that is based on people who have migrated. And for those who have migrated from one place to the other, that leaves a very, very deep scar and a very, very deep question regarding what is one's home and what is one's home language. Some of the people who participated have been born to families that are 7th, 9th, one even 12th generation in Israel, and some, like Anna, who's a DJ, came at the age of 16, or Andre, who came, I think, at the age of 9, and grew up in one language, was brought to another place that is today his home, but has always lived this bilateral life. Or myself being 3rd generation, these growing up in these in-between cultures always leaves something open about where one can or does belong to. And I think that a lot of the music that comes in really, really stems from there. So in the 30 minutes of this documentary.
Okay, thanks. Do people actually talk do Israelis say, I'm 3rd generation, I'm 5th generation? Is something that is common in language to talk about?
In some sense, yes. Yeah. Where people come from makes a very, very big difference. Yaya, who's not in the film because the sound was so terrible in his conversation, who's, for example, from Ethiopia. People's experiences as migrants, Israel developed as a society, and of course, people who came earlier had much more influence regarding what the society looked like. So more and more people who joined later always felt like outsiders, and there's a lot of racism, whether it be towards Jews that came at first from Middle Eastern or North African countries to Jews that came later from the ex-Soviet Union or Ethiopian Jews. So it's very, very present in society. I would say that society is quite divided, and there's very few people who, or in the end it defines a lot of who you are, where you live, what you do in life. It's in that sense quite hierarchical. So I would say so. And there's definitely not such a huge population that's been living there for 9 or 12 generations, but there definitely are. But yeah, I would say in some sense there's a differentiation between people who have migrated as 1st generation, or the first people to migrate, to people who are considered tzabal, which is the full Israeli people like myself who were born already in Israel. So it's definitely very present.
Kind of earn power through the generations.
Unfortunately, yes, in some parts.
Never thought about it.
And I think what's interesting in comparison to Germany is that part of education in education schools is that one actually researches their entire family history. So you create this family tree of all your parents and your grandparents and your great-great-grandparents, so everybody, one's family and their roots and their history is about as embedded into Israeli culture as, I don't know, falafel. I mean, it's really something that everybody has a very strong identity to, and family in general is a very dominant thing, which I think is a very, very big difference from here, for example. I mean, I don't think anybody does something like that here, right? Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, that's fair enough. Would you like to hear some of these people's music? That was a yes. All right, very nice. That was the right answer. I won't play the entire tracks, but just a little bit of taste from it, so you know who's who and what is what. Let me show you their pictures, so you can keep them in your mind. Okay, so this is Latifa Punk and Nimoy. They're both Jerusalem-based artists. By now, Latifa has moved to Tel Aviv, and Nimoy has moved to Berlin. But, I actually can't do that, sorry. I have to do it like this. So this is Latifa's music. She creates, I would say, sound that is very, very Jerusalem, in the sense that it incorporates a lot of Eastern melodies and Middle Eastern music together with electronics and a lot of very, very dense layers and distortion. One little taste. Next we had this is Yaya Simone Mahali, which I spoke earlier about. He always works together with both audio and visual materials, and usually works very much with documentary materials. He's originally, well, he's half Eritrean and half Ethiopian, which is already a whole conflict in itself, considering that this was once upon a time one country. But he has went back several times and filmed a lot of footage that he then works and manipulates live, both audio and visually. And I'll play you a little bit of that. For that, I have to actually find it. There it is. This is recording. For this specific performance, I'll play you another track. He actually, it's a full story that follows a refugee. There's a lot of refugees that are coming from Darfur and from Sudan to Israel at the moment, since the places are not that far away. And there's by now over 20,000 African refugees that are living in Israel, and he followed one person in the desert, actually in their fleeing and entering of Israel. So part of his live performance also includes interviews and shots from the desert. I think in general it touches both on his own story as well as the current political situation. Music with very simple means, or at least from this time, which was about 5 years ago. By now people have expanded, but I'll do maybe one more, which is these two guys. These two guys create a group called Tedel. They work only with live analog synthesizers, which, as I said, at that time were kind of impossible to find in Israel. So They imported them from wherever or found them from wherever. These were actually the ones that are both, I think, 7th and 9th generation in Israel, one from Afghani descent and one from Syrian. And let me play you one of their tracks, which is mostly drone music. So, as I said, it's a really very, very wide range of music, and you can't say that anything is necessarily very distinguishable as Israeli. It's very influenced from things abroad. For some people, their cultural background is very relevant. For others, it isn't, and it's not that you can make any real statement. But that's why it was important for us to bring a really wide array of music, but to have this ability for people to come and enter these people's world a little bit to understand where they come from. I will continue just a little, just with one last development. Just for anybody that might be interested, I brought here, we released a compilation in 2006 with 4 CDs that includes music from all the Israeli and international artists that participated in the festival. Should anybody be interested, I have a few copies here. It has a really, really wide and amazing array, and inside there's also a booklet that tells a little bit about each of the artists and gives a link to their website, etc. Yes.
Because you said the first musician that she moved to Berlin, concerning those questions about identity and home, where you belong to, do people move less often or more often to other cities or other countries? What do you think?
I would say that Israelis are continuously leaving or traveling. Very common for people to go study abroad because schools are better abroad. People can get good scholarships, and there's this fleeing of the brain, as is happening in a lot of other countries, that the people who are very successful are leaving to work, whether it be high-tech companies abroad or going to schools abroad. I would say that in general, and this is a little bit where I'm continuing to with C.sides, is that the community that I was part of in Jerusalem at a certain period of time doesn't exist anymore because the city has changed, because it's much more religious, it's much more strict, budgets have changed. I mean, it's really hard to pinpoint and say what changed so much, but people have left. A lot of people moved to Tel Aviv, which is kind of the most close to European place, I would say, that has free art and culture and endless cafes and restaurants and bars. So that's and a lovely beach. So most people ended up there, and a lot of people left the country. And
for the art scene, when you said it, it got nourished in this time of peace in the 90s. It's 11 years later, the war. I don't remember, 4 or 5 weeks of the war with Lebanon. And now, when so many people change, do they also leave? Do they also leave from the art scenes, like the same percentage like in the rest of the population, or do artists tend to leave? You know what I mean? I mean, it's a constant fluctuating.
Yeah, fluctuation.
Yeah, fluctuation in the art and music and film scene, probably.
I can't really say in numbers. I mean, there's one thing we have to understand, that leaving is already a privilege. I mean, Israel is not part of the EU. People can't just come here.
True. Yeah.
It's not that you can just get up and go to the United States either. So there's few people who have a passport, because, for example, a lot of people have Polish or German passports that came from this part of Europe because through their grandparents who fled. For other people, they're able to get scholarships through schools. So being an artist definitely helps in applying for scholarships in different schools, as residencies. So I would say, if we're looking at the total of society, whoever is, as always, whoever already has privileges, such as education or being an artist, which in itself is such a huge privilege to even, right, be able to say, oh, I think I should make some art. Let's try that out, right? And not have to go actually, whatever, take care of other things. And then, of course, this is the sector that leaves the most. So I think Israel is a very, very fast-changing place. As I said, the population continuously changes, the reality changes, the conflict changes. There's wars, then there's not wars, there's conflict, and the society is continuously changing, which makes building things very, very difficult. Places open, they quickly close. Things last for a couple of years, magazines start, and then they disappear. So things are always going in and out, and that makes another difficult part of art production, because what you knew yesterday is just not relevant tomorrow. For us as a festival, we started in a very specific situation with a certain community that existed in Jerusalem, with a certain political situation. Today we're looking at, are we going to do the next festival, when and where? Well, there's a DJ from Berlin that's in Israel every single weekend. Everybody listens to electronic music. There's a very, very happening art scene. Is it really crucial that we deal with this type of art? Not necessarily. Not as it was in like the community who we were supporting as independent artists has a platform now. They don't need us to do this, and there's no reason for us to do it if we're not needed. So we're continuously having to, or choosing to reinvent ourselves to make something that is significant for the situation. But the situation changes very, very rapidly, and that has a very, very big effect on the art and the cultural scene.
Was there ever an option for C-sides to travel? Israel, Palestine, Germany?
This is the topic I want to talk about. So, very good question that you all wanted to ask, but were too embarrassed, obviously, is what about Palestinian artists? And what is our cooperation with Palestinian artists? There's obviously a lot of Palestinian artists. There's even like a modern art museum or a lot of projects that have started in Palestine. But the situation as it is today, and we have cooperated with Palestinians as C-sides, but what we have to understand that in this period of this euphoric 90s of Israel's peace process, the situation in the territories was becoming much, much worse. And there was all this money being spent on peace projects and children's projects and cultural projects. And at one point the Palestinians said, you know, it's really nice that you want all these lovely projects, but our situation is continuously getting worse. And the more that we cooperate with you, the more that we are normalizing this situation. And that's when they started with a cultural boycott, and boycotting any cooperation between non-profit organizations, NGOs, between Israel and Palestine, and also cultural cooperation. Because after all these years of experiences, they said, great, you make this theater, and you must feel wonderful about it, but we are living under occupation, and we still don't have our very basic rights, and our rights are continuously being more and more taken away. So today, we are actually still in that same position. And there is cooperation that is being done between Israeli and Palestinian artists, but it's happening under a political platform. It has to be a political statement of a political event. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult for Palestinians to participate, also for artists from Egypt or from other neighboring countries, because there is so much pressure that is put on them. Why would they participate in something like this? Why would they go to a dance party in Israel when the occupation still exists, when the situation is still like that? It's not explainable. As I said, art has an impact in a very factual way, but it's not necessarily a measurable way that says, hey, we did this and this is the outcome. But if you put a banner that says, end the occupation, rights to refugees, or whatever, then it's possible. And when I said earlier that we had to make the decision, are we going to be a political festival that has artistic content or an art festival that has political content, we chose the artistic direction. There's still stuff that's happening on a political level, but sadly, it's very, very hard for us to do that within C-sides. So also for Palestinian organizations, for example, we can't send we at first thought, okay, of course us Israelis don't participate, but maybe the international artist could go and spend a few days in Palestine and perform there, whether it be at the Goethe Institute or whatever. Also not possible, because the moment that these artists cooperate with us, it already becomes problematic because we're considered an Israeli institution. So we do have meetings, and as I said, we do provide tours to understand the situation. We're trying to find different alternatives, maybe for next year actually, but it's very, very, very complicated, or there isn't a real. It's almost impossible, yes. So, and that's part of this crazy situation. And so we kind of go back a little bit for where we are right now with the project. The last festival that we did was in 2009. As I said, the community that we were part of in Jerusalem kind of disintegrated and doesn't exist anymore, and everybody moved to Tel Aviv. So we said to ourselves, also, we've had a lot of difficulties in Jerusalem because it is, for example, it's such a religious city that any venue that we cooperate with, we cannot have parties on Friday night because it's a religious city. And venues are closed on Friday in order to be kosher. And you can imagine how detrimental that is for a festival that deals with experimental music and then needs like the techno crowd to actually come and party. Friday night is usually the big partying night. So we were actually asked to participate in what was called the Biennale for Contemporary Music in Tel Aviv. And in 2009, we moved the production in Tel Aviv. And it sounds very funny, but it's the truth. A month before the festival, the war in Gaza broke out. So yet again, we were faced with another production, and yet again, there was a war, and we were sitting there, and I think for me, the war in Gaza was at least as painful as the one in the north, because what happens to the society is just really painful to watch, and what the spirit is, and how people discuss things, and it was a really, really, really terrible time. And again, we sat there and we're like, oh, we have graphic design. Should we make the stickers 2 millimeters bigger? And it feels a little strange to discuss how big our logo should be on a flyer when there's a really, really, really terrible situation. And we, again, of course, as I said, we are not a political festival, but we still find it important to speak out against war, to speak out against violence, and specifically violence against civilians. So again, we made a public statement against the war. And we actually, at that point, in 2006 when we did this, actually one of our sponsors left because they didn't want to support us after we made a statement against the war. And in 2009, there was a Facebook group that was calling to boycott our festival because of this question of how dare we combine politics and art, and that art and clubbing and music is not political and should never be political. And so this discussion is just continuously happening. We have to plan our next festival, and what we've done this year, if you can just hang on a little bit longer. We did a new project. We decided that we want to try something new, and we have this freedom with C.sides that it's a label and it's a platform and it's basically run by myself and Glitterbug, that we can basically do whatever we want. And we said, okay, what do we want to do? We weren't sure. We knew that we didn't want to yet make another festival because it takes a year to put this thing together. It's exhausting, and there's always a war, and just emotionally, I think it's not fair for us to do another festival, but emotionally it's just very, very exhausting. So we decided that we want to create a release. We want to ask musicians or artists or bands to create what we called audible approaches for a better place. To give the artist a task to make music for a better world. What that means, we don't know. But we wanted to see if we give somebody this task, what would they do? So we asked 10 artists and bands and musicians of different backgrounds to create a new work, and we wanted it to be a work and not a track, meaning we wanted it to be somewhere between, I would say, 12 to 15 minutes, something that is not a pop song and not a regular techno track for those who work in techno within like the 6-minute limit, something that has time to develop, to think, to create a new work under this title. And we were lucky enough that, again, with the Haus der Kultur und der Welt, they picked up on this idea and said, why don't we bring this project live? And last Thursday, we were in Berlin, and we were able to bring all these artists together and perform all these works on one stage, which was absolutely amazing. And I don't know if you noticed that the world is so much better now. Almost. So We have artists, and I want to show you a little clip, and I'm really sorry that it's also in terrible resolution and sound because we haven't gotten the recordings yet, so it's just a little bit of leftover, but I'd really love to share it with you because we're really happy about it, and we hope that we can actually bring this project to Israel and maybe also to Palestine and work with local artists somehow to connect this because it's been really, really amazing, and it will be released on our label, on the C.sides label, in September. So this is a sneak preview to something that is not even close to being released to the public yet. And the artists, as I said, the amazing thing about the artists is that most of them are living in Berlin, and like all of us, I mean, I'm not living in Berlin, but I am there at least once a month because of projects, is that we all ended up kind of there, and it's people from Denmark, and people from Canada, and people from Palestine, and people from wherever, all somehow ended up in this area, and we could kind of bring them all together for this project. And I think it's quite symbolic for talking about this people who live this in-between homeless world. Then all these people are definitely some of them. So again, apologies for the video and the audio, but I think we'll survive this. This is myself actually performing with Glitterbug and Inas Masalha, who is an Israeli-Palestinian Arabic soprano singer. And it's of course, as I said, the works are about 15 minutes long, so these are just very short excerpts. Also an Israeli musician. Christian Löffler, sorry. And this is Connor. Brandbrauer Frick, for those who know them. Somebody even made a film for the project.
Feel the old ways of the world tremble in their beings. They have formed a sisterhood, which is devoted to helping the sick and the poor.
That was just a little taste of a little bit where I just came back from and what we're hoping to continue to build and involve local artists in, as I said, in Israel and in Palestine, and see how to continue this project. And maybe the very last thing that I will show you, I mean, unless anybody want to ask any questions? Keep on.
Wenn das Englisch ein Problem ist und irgendwo ist im Kopf eine deutsche Frage.
Ja, kann auch in Deutsch sein.
Genau, erstens kann Ronni auch Deutsch, mindestens so gut wie ich Englisch. Und ich kann aber auch helfen zu übersetzen. Also das wäre jetzt schade, wenn das irgendwo bei euch im Kopf rumort und ihr stellt sie einfach nicht, weil es die Sprachbarriere ist. In der Zwischenzeit, wo ihr darüber nachdenkt, I'm going to ask you a question in English. You in Cologne. So how did that happen?
That's the very last part that we go back to me. So as I said, for myself, I realized, I mean, the years that I was involved in Israel, whether in cultural production or human rights, were difficult, to say the very least. They were amazing, and I think that we did a lot of amazing things within a very crazy reality, but there's a toll that one pays for it, emotionally and physically, of living in such extreme situations. And as I said, there's a few people who have the privilege of being able to somehow leave. I think for me, what it came down to was that I realized that I want to work on my art, and that I want my art to be independent from Israel, and that I couldn't myself differentiate anymore who I am and who I am in Israel, if that makes any sense, and what I could be if I wasn't within this circumstance. And that my very important conclusion is that I cannot create art in Israel for myself, that I am in no way able to disconnect from the situation, to feel free enough emotionally and personally to actually do this thing which is called making art, because I think I'm always persuaded, either my phone is always ringing, or something terrible happens that is obviously much more important than this thing of making art, or I feel that I have to make something that is somehow relevant to the situation. And I really, really love to work very, very abstractly with textures and forms, and that for me couldn't fit in Israel. I couldn't find my mental space to do that, and I wanted to give myself a chance and see what would happen if I step away from there and find a place that's different, that allows me some freedom. And it took me a little while, but I have to admit that I found that here and have a lovely studio in Cologne that I'm really, really happy with, but also carry a lot of guilt feelings for having this privilege in making art, just because I can. It's not obvious for me still, after all this time. But I think that I owe it to myself to give this experience a bit longer, to see where I can grow within it and what I can do. And it took me a while to even get to the place where I feel that certain freedom. So I'm going to stay a little longer, if that's all right. And I ended up here because Till Glitterbug and the whole C.sides thing actually happened in Cologne in the beginning, so it was kind of a very obvious place. But as I said, I spent half my time by now in Berlin and kind of go in between. So I wanted to close, I thought, what would make sense with something that is not related to C.sides at all, but is something that is still relevant to the things that we've been discussing about, and it's just a small music video that I made for an artist called Gold Panda, who's a British musician, or makes electronic music on Ghostly International is the name of the label. And for me, when I work in the field of music videos or creating visuals for somebody's music, which I get to do, it's really important for me. I think that video is so easily overwhelming because it's so much more dominant than the music very often, and very easily it can overshadow the music. And in a lot of projects, that's okay, and it should do that. And in a lot of places, one has to be really, really careful how not to do that, how not to become too dominant, how to let the music shine for what it is, and how to be somehow either a supporting act or a translator or whatever. And in this specific video for Gold Panda, it's for his track of his latest album, which is called Marriage. The name of the track is called Marriage, and it's a very, very sweet little track, and he doesn't have vocals. You know, music videos with vocals are always better because you can add all this drama with lip syncing, so there's no vocals. And I wanted to, as I said, I want to also keep for this track its sweetness, and it's really, really humble and very unpretentious, and I want to make sure that I do that. But when he asked me to make this video for him, because I've done previous work with him, I was on the road traveling with the live performance that I do with Glitterbug. And I said, well, I can try to make this on the road, and let's see what happens. And he said, okay, let's do it. And so this video was actually filmed while I was touring here and in the Netherlands and in India and in Israel. And it's very much people-based, which I think a lot of this presentation has been, about people and people who are in between or from places and kind of share something in common, but kind of don't. And here's Gold Panda for you.
Ganz viel Licht wegnehmen einmal.
Would be amazing. Einmal, nur einmal. That's it. Thank you. This is your moment.
Any questions?
You spoke a lot about the connection between artists from Israel and Germany. Is it the strongest connections? Is it the strongest connections between Israel and Germany, or are there other?
I would say, I mean, in the field of electronic music, I think that Germany today has so much that is happening in comparison to other places, also as far as like club culture and so on. So there's always been a connection. I would say that there's a lot of, I mean, there's definitely a very clear historical connection. And I think that what happened in Germany, which is different than anywhere else in the rest of Europe, is that specifically in Berlin, is that it's being built anew. And there is so much opportunity for people to come in and do something. I mean, there's very few of us who can go to London and just, you know, open up a bar or a gallery or whatever. And Berlin is a capital in Western Europe that you can just go and basically anybody can decide to open a bar or a gallery is something that is very, very unique. And in that sense, very similar to a little bit of the spirit or the atmosphere in Israel, along with the no limitation of drinking hours in comparison, right, to the UK where bars close at 1 and Israel's Mediterranean place, so things are open very late. So I think there's a lot of things that are similar in that sense, and there's a lot of curiosity on both sides, I would say, much more, or at the moment, much more than other places. Definitely.
My question is about you as an artist. Was there like a key moment when you recognized for yourself you're an artist, or you think you've been born like that, or was there any key situation, like, or any project, what created yourself as a professional artist?
I think it's a very loaded question you ask. And I think people have very, very different opinions on the matter. I think for myself, the way I view it is that I'm an artist regardless of whether I produce or I don't produce art. That my being as an artist is not always dependent on my creation of art. That has to do more with my way in which I see or view myself and the world. It's something that's very, very emotional for me. And I'm not saying that like one is born an artist or isn't born an artist. I mean, I don't think that we can say things like that about anything regarding humans, right? We're born into certain social and cultural conditions, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people who live like in slums and might be like the most brilliant piano players that we could ever imagine, but they've never had the opportunity to even think that they might want to play an instrument because at the age of 6 they're chopping little rocks in a whatever. So I mean, it's not that simple, but I think I can't say that there's a point in time that I declared or realized that I'm an artist. But I think that I was an artist before I was dedicating my time to making art, if that makes any sense. It might also not, and that's also okay. But I mean, I think that if I would stop making art today and will not produce anything ever again, I would still consider myself an artist. Does that make any sense? Maybe, maybe not. I don't think that I can rationalize it or explain it very well. But
no, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
This is actually a question regarding your 2005-2006 starts as a festival. What kind of reactions did you get, like from inside the scene and from outside the scene? Did you reach beyond the electronic or free art scene that was there in the beginning? Or?
I would say, I think yes and no. Of course, I think that definitely, I mean, if we looked at the venues that existed or the events, they were pretty small. Like a lot of the bars could host 30 people, right? So I think we were able to draw to very experimental music a much, much larger audience. To say that we were really able to draw people who never had any connection to this, I would say maybe only parents and friends of parents of participating artists, which I guess is also something. We started with a very, very wide range that also touched on hip-hop and modern composition, and I would say that the people who come from modern composition would stay a little later more into the techno, and the people of the techno would come earlier and would hear more of the other music. So there was definitely more mingling of different types of music, but I think that that's something that in general at that time in Jerusalem was happening, that people who were into, I would say, alternative music were curious about all kinds of music, where today I think things have become much more specified. People like a certain type of techno or a certain type of indie music, and there's much less curiosity. I think at that time it wasn't just because of us, there was just a lot more curiosity. I think we had good publicity, which helped us out a lot to draw in people who, I mean, I didn't know most of the audience, so I think that's already a good start, but I think it was due to publicity, but it's not that far-reaching. What we'd like to do with this project, if we're able to bring it to Israel or to do it in Israel, is to actually do a tour throughout Israel and actually go to places like there's a very interesting film school in the desert, which is called Sapir College, and they do, it's also a little bit, they do film and also TV and communication, and it's also an engineering school. And they have a very interesting program because they're very, very aware that they are placed in the desert, which is where a lot of very impoverished cities are, and very, very poor people live there because it's the middle of the desert. So the population that they draw in are kids from Tel Aviv that want to go study at this very prestigious school, but a lot of people from the area, so Bedouins and people that come from the poor parts of the Israeli population, and they're a very, very critical and very interesting school, and I think one of the most interesting film schools in Israel because they're so daring in their social topics. So we'd like to take C-sides and actually travel to several places where we have a real partner, but be able to do something in, for example, one of these towns to reach a totally fresh audience. On the other hand, it's pretty experimental music, and you also have to realize that for people who have never been exposed to something like this, it's sometimes painful, and that's okay to realize.
To this question, as you said, it's an artist festival with political content, but get you any response from politics side or governmental side, or even Palestinian politics side?
From official politicians, definitely not. I would say that more, I would say on a municipal level, that we were not able to receive any municipal support. I would say mainly because of, it's not only our political position, but also just the type of art that we deal with. As I said, one of our funders actually decided not to support us because of having a clear political message against the war, which is the closest that I would say to a political level, because it was a political decision of a very large foundation that is closer to the political circles than I would say some of the smaller foundations. But as far as the political government level, honestly, they could care less.
But they did.
They just don't care, no. But there was, I can tell you that when we did the festival, because of the content, the venue, which is actually very interesting, we always switch venues because we find it interesting to take a place that's not usually used for this type of music and to build the whole thing and give it a new connotation. So in 2006, we did it in the Congress Center, it's kind of like the Messe of Jerusalem, which was actually where the military headquarters was in 1967 during the war. And it's where the Eurovision was, and a lot of other different things. So it's a really heavy, serious place, and with polished floors. And they were really, really nervous, and they got extra security prepared because they thought that there would be demonstrations outside the festival, and people were really concerned that there would be an outcry. But as I said, I think that there is always kind of I think in every society that the people who are on the edge are usually ridiculed by, the majority. That doesn't seem very threatening to them because they're the majority. So.
And did you have any like a certain message for every annual festival? Like, is it a general discussion about politics and society, or is it on a certain context? Like, it's topical, of course, as the war that happens in this moment. Right. But do you have like actively planned like a slogan or something?
No, that's very, very important to us, that there is no slogan. We don't ask any of the artists to sign any statement or anything. They know what we stand for. We stand for it publicly. So if they're opposed to it, most likely they won't participate. But we, as I said, we don't want it to be a political festival. It's important for us to discuss what it means for us to do this, and what are the questions that we all have, because we have them. And the artists that come from abroad have them, and the artists from Israel have them. So we think that it's important to speak about them and not ignore that. But it's really, really important for us to make sure that this is a festival that's about art, that's dealing with reality and dealing with the context of reality, but it's an art and music festival, and that it's foremost and firstmost celebrating that. Everything else is circumstantial. That's where we live, that's what the world looks like, and we just want to be open to dealing with it because it affects who we are and what we do, and it affects the entire festival as an entity.
Do you plan on going back to Israel once you're done here with whatever you do right now?
With whatever thing I'm on. I don't know. I can't really say. I mean, I think about it often, and my family's there, which makes it, of course, I think, more difficult. The political situation at the moment is even more, I would say, intense than it was before because of the current government and a lot of the laws that they're passing. Like everywhere else in the world, like the right is taking over and capitalism is taking over even more extremely than before, and governments are much more there's just this neo-conservatism, and in Israel especially, there's a really, really, really right-wing government at the moment. So at the moment, it's hard for me to imagine, just because that place drives me a little crazy sometimes. But it's definitely possible and definitely something that I think about. I think if I have the amazing privilege of being able to live half-time there and to have like somewhere to live here and also an apartment there that I can just continue to go back and forth, I think that would be the perfect solution for me, because it's as much time as I will spend here, and even once my German will be perfect, I definitely will never feel completely at home here, and I miss speaking Hebrew, and I miss certain things that have to do with something that is a feeling of home, and I don't know, I bet that could change. I mean, a lot of people, right, who have left places go back there many years later, and it's a different place than what they remembered or what their heart was yearning for, and it just doesn't work out anymore. So I don't know, but I'm definitely still very committed to that place, and which is why it's really important for me that we continue the work of C-Sides and continue to do things in Israel and to broaden a little bit what we do, so we're not just in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, but to go to different places, because I obviously care about that place and want it to be a better place than it is right now. So maybe that means that I do want to go back there. I don't know. We'll see.
Is your work in Germany completely non-political, or is there also a political aspect of it?
I would say that I go through different phases. I would say that some of it is political because it's very autobiographical, and in that sense it is political because it deals with certain, both in my, I would say my identity in Israel as a Jewish Ashkenazi woman and what that means within that society, and also myself living here in Germany, and big parts of my family were originated in Germany and fled in 1938, so there's a whole part of that I would say that it's political in some sense that I work and deal with. I think for this last project, for example, that we did what we performed at the HKW, the amazing thing is that there were so many people involved. There was a Libyan and 2 Palestinians, and it was really the first time that we could do a project that was about art and music without having, like, the politics were something that was unanimous in the sense of, like, you know, people wanting to do this experiment and see what happens, but it was the first time that the politics of the real world, or as it exists, were not part of it, and that was quite refreshing. But I'd say yes, it's again a question about what is art and, right? So, yes and no.
Okay, I don't see any more hands. Thanks for the questions. You should definitely, if you have the chance, go and visit Israel, or the Middle East.
Yes, because you can. You actually have a passport that allows you. So.
Very good. Go and check it out. Thank you so much for coming, Ronni.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you all.